It is in this dead being, then, that the mental processes and specific functions of the brain would have to display their outer reality. A reality, however, which is still in the individual himself. For the relation of those processes and functions to the skull, which as a dead being does not have spirit dwelling within it, there presents itself in the first instance the external mechanical relation established above, so that the organs proper, and these are in the brain, here press the skull out, around, there widen or flatten it, or in whatever other way one cares to represent this action on it. Being itself a part of the organism, it must indeed be credited, as in the case of every bone, with a living, spontaneous, formative activity, so that from this point of view, it is rather the skull that on its part presses on the brain and fixes its outer boundary. And it is better able to do this, being the harder. But in that case, the same relation would still obtain in the determination of their reciprocal activity. For whether the skull is the determining factor or the factor determined, this would produce no alteration at all in the causal connection, except that the skull would then be made the immediate organ of self-consciousness, because in it, qua cause, would be found the aspect of being for self. But in point of fact, since being for self as an organic spontaneity is equally present in both, any causal connection between them is ruled out. This development of the two, however, would be inwardly connected and would be an organic pre-established harmony, which would leave the two interrelated aspects free in respect of each other, each with its own shape to which the shape of the other need not correspond. And still more so as regards the relation between the shape and the quality, just as the shape of the grape and the taste of the wine are mutually independent. But since the determination of being for self falls on the side of the brain, but that of existence on the side of the skull, there is also to be established a causal connection between them within the organic unity, a necessary relation between them as external for one another, that is, a relation itself external through which, therefore, the shape of each would be determined by the other. This subsection of the Observing Reason section is subtitled Physiognomy and Phrenology. And these were two pseudosciences of Hegel's time that I don't think there's an awful lot of credence in today, but people were trying to work out a philosophy of nature that would take into account human beings and their individual characteristics and how they could be classed into types or tendencies. And so in section or the paragraph 329, which we're now going to look at, we're seeing the transition from physiognomy, which really has to do with the entire body, to looking at phrenology, which was much more specifically located, you could say, specifically located in the skull. And what Hegel is going to point out to us, now that he's got the brain as being the sort of indwelling seat of spirit, as he called it in the previous paragraphs, as being the organ in which spirit is able to engage the rest of the body and thereby use that as sort of a tool to engage the rest of the world, what we're going to see is the looking at the connection between the skull, something that we can actually observe, and the brain, which we can observe, right? You can cut somebody's head open and take a look around inside, but you can't really tell quite so much of what's going on. Now, in the present, of course, we have other means of access to the brain. We know quite a bit more about it than they did in Hegel's time, so you have to kind of remember that as we're working through this. This is from over 2 centuries ago. So Hegel says that it is in this dead being. What's the dead being? The caput mortuum that he talked about in the last paragraph, the skull. That the mental processes and specific functions of the brain, right, what's going on as spiritual realities, mental, and spiritual in German, geistige, right, would have to display their outer reality. And then he says, a reality, however, which is still in the individual himself. So the idea there that's underlying phrenology is that we can examine the skull and thereby get to know something about the individual. Why? Because the brain in some way determines the skull. The brain is what we're really after. The brain is where all the interesting stuff is happening, but we have to look at the skull on the outside. And really, you'd probably have to shave the person's head or find some way to get a hold of that skull by itself. A lot of the work that was being done was looking at cadavers' skulls. So he goes on and he says, the relation of those processes and functions to the skull, which is a dead being, does not have spirit dwelling within it, presents itself in the first instance, the external mechanical relation established above. So that the organs proper, these are in the brain, right? The parts of the brain press outward on the skull. This is part of the idea behind phrenology, that because of the way in which the brain develops, it's going to push parts of the skull outward, and if they don't develop, perhaps that part of the skull will be recessed inward. So, for example, if the frontal lobe is really important in cognition and, use of language and other higher order faculties, then if somebody's got kind of a squished in front of their head, you should be able to surmise that they're not very capable in that way. Whatever capacities they have aren't really developed. But if they got a big old, noggin protruding out in front, this is why you see so many literary descriptions of the great foreheads of people, because this idea that, the brain is pushing the skull out, so the bigger forehead you are, the smarter you must be. There really isn't that much to that as we know. But this is, the way some of the science of the time was conceptualizing things. So he says, the organs proper, these are in the brain, here press the skull out, around, there widen or flatten it, or in whatever way one cares to represent this action on it. Hegel is not buying into this. Hegel is saying this is the way in which people who are into this way of trying to observe individuality, human individuality, are making sense of things. They're saying that the skull pushes or perhaps even doesn't push or flattens or whatever it's going to do, the parts of the skull. So the skull then is what? A reflection of the interior reality of the person's brain. That means that it's a reflection, exterior reflection of the geistige, the spiritual reality of the individual, which cannot be observed directly. Remember that this entire section is observing reason, right? So this is part of the much larger reason section. This is, we've traced this long path through the beginnings of observing reason, looking at living beings, trying to make sense out of individuality, psychological laws. Now we're getting down to the really nitty-gritty. This is an attempt to do so. So he says, being itself a part of the organism, the skull, must indeed be credited, as in the case of every bone, with a living, spontaneous, formative activity. So that from this point of view, it's rather the skull that on its part presses on the brain and fixes its outer boundary. And here Hegel makes a joke. Hegel doesn't make a lot of jokes, so when he does, it's good to point them out. He says, it's better able to do this being the harder. I didn't say it was a funny joke, but it is, at least it's funny for me. He's saying, look, if we want to say that one thing influences the other when it comes to this, the skull is in fact a bone, so there's growth happening within it, then why wouldn't the skull press upon the brain? Why would the brain be pushing outward on the skull? It's not like the brain really is a muscle or anything like that. So, he's going to talk a little bit later of a pre-established harmony, and that's the way we might think of the real relation, at least to some degree, between the brain and the skull in a normally growing human being, starting as a baby. Babies got those giant heads compared to the rest of their body, but their skull has got some soft spots, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger to make up for the space that's going to be occupied by the brain. But it's not like the brain is actually pushing the skull outward. Hegel's saying, look, if that's what you think, why not just think of the skull as the one that's like confining the brain? So he goes on and he says, In that case, the same relation would still obtain in the determination of their reciprocal activity. Here, he is pointing out something really important. So, phrenology as a science, if it is indeed a science, and Hegel doesn't think that it really is, has to give us some sort of intelligible relation between these two factors, the skull and the brain. And he's saying it fails to do so because maybe, we could understand or imagine some sort of relation between them that has to do with certain parts of the brain being more active or being more developed and then pushing the skull up. Well, why not think of it the other way? The fact that we can think about it either way shows us that there's a lack of real causality there. That there's something like an arbitrariness to what we're imagining. So he goes on and he says, whether the skull is the determining factor or the factor determined, this would produce no alteration at all in the causal connection, except that then the skull would be made the immediate organ of self-consciousness. Why? Because then the skull would be being for itself, which is what spirit is, which is what we've been after this entire time, trying to observe, trying to make sense of. But we've already said that the skull is something, at least in respect to the brain, and certainly spirit, it's a dead thing. It's the caput mortuum, the dead head, in many respects, right? So that's not going to work. He says that the skull would be made the immediate organ of self-consciousness because in it, qua cause, would be found the aspect of being in its being for self. But in point of fact, he says, since being for self is, as an organic spontaneity, is equally present in both, any causal connection between them is ruled out. What is he saying there? Well, we already know that the brain, this is from the previous paragraphs, is how the being for self of spirit has its reflective activity that engages corporeally, causally, with the rest of the world, but specifically through its own body. Now we're also saying that the skull is being for self, and we're saying that these two are somehow connected with each other, and we're not sure which direction the causality goes. In this case, Hegel's not spelling this out very well. He's sort of skipping steps here. We would have two beings for self that are somehow connected together, and you would say, well, what's going on here? There's kind of a redundancy, isn't there? So he goes on and he says, not only does this rule any causal connection out, he says that this development of the two would be inwardly connected. And here he talks about an organic pre-established harmony. Now, what would be the problem with that? It wouldn't explain anything to us, would it? It wouldn't provide us with any sort of intelligibility, which then we could use as observing reason to make sense out of the individuality that's supposed to be connected with this noggin, the whole head, and connected specifically with this contained brain within the skull. If it's just a pre-established harmony, there's really no interconnection causally. And phrenology is based around the idea that there is a causal relation between the interiority, i.e. the brain, and the exteriority, the skull, what Hegel's going to call the display of outer reality. So if we have a pre-established harmony, that's not going to get us what we need. If we can't establish which way the causality goes, that's not going to get us what we need. It's starting to look as if phrenology as a science is inherently problematic. So he goes on and he says, this pre-established harmony would leave the two interrelated aspects free in relation of each other, each with its own shape to which the shape of the other need not correspond. And here he's got a really interesting simile or metaphor here, an analogy actually. He says, Still more so as regards the relation between the shape and the quality, just as the shape of the grape and the taste of the wine are mutually independent. Now, there's a lot of things when it comes to wine and when it comes to grapes that are not mutually independent of each other, right? When we're talking about wine tasting, one of the key terms is terroir, and that means, where it was grown and all the environmental conditions. Remember back to Hegel talking about environmental laws, and a really well informed and trained connoisseur of wine can tell you quite a bit about the wine and the grape specifically by the taste of it. But it doesn't really matter what shape the grapes are. I mean, as a matter of fact, if we could conceive of them as being cubes or something like that, it probably wouldn't make a hell of a lot of difference, now would it? I mean, maybe, who knows? We could. This would be an interesting thing for experiment. Well, it's the same way for the skull and the brain. I mean, if you look at it, the skull and the brain do kind of fit in well together, but there's some slippage between them, isn't there? And you can't conclude an awful lot about the specific organs, well, let's not say organs, let's say suborgans within the brain based solely on possessing the dead skull. I mean, people did this. They would take skulls and fill them up with ball bearings and measure how many it took to fill them up. And, well, you've got more ball bearings, so you must have had a bigger brain, so you must have been smarter. This is the sort of thing that pseudoscience was doing in the 19th century and also into the 20th century. They'd take all sorts of measurements with calipers. Sometimes they'd do this on living people. They'd, feel around and, oh, you've got a bump there. You must be a criminal type. Oh, you've got this kind of ridge here. Oh, you must be very intellectual, or you're a poet, or any of these sorts of things. Hegel is, you might say at this point, he's going along with the phrenologists, giving them as much rope as they need in order to hang them, which is what he's going to do by the end of this section. But here he's stressing, look, this relationship that's supposed to hold, that's really key for phrenology, is not really working out so well. It says, since the determination of being for self falls on the side of the brain, but that of existence, Dasein, on the side of the skull, there is also to be established a causal connection between them within the organic unity. Within the organic unity, I suppose, would be the head or the body as such. So there's a necessary relation between them as external for one another, i.e. a relation itself external through which, therefore, the shape of each would be determined by the other. And now he's not endorsing this. This is what phrenology is sort of forcing itself into the corner of believing in order to make any of this work. So there has to be some sort of reciprocal relation of causality between them. Maybe the brain pushes outward, maybe the skull pushes inward. Somehow they affect each other. That's what you need in order to get this entire project of phrenology as a specific type of physiognomy off the ground. However, as regards the determination in which the organ of self-consciousness would act causally on the opposite aspect, all sorts of things can be said. For what is in question is the constitution of a cause which is considered in regard to its indifferent outer existence, its shape and size, a cause whose inner being and being for self are to be precisely of a kind which does not concern the immediate or outer existence. The organic spontaneous formation of the skull is in the first place indifferent to any mechanical influence exerted on it, and the relationship of these two relations, since the former is a relating of itself to itself, is just this very indefiniteness and unboundedness. Furthermore, even if the brain received into itself the distinctions of spirit as existential distinctions, and were a plurality of internal organs each occupying a different space, it would be left undetermined whether a spiritual feature would, according as it was originally stronger or weaker, be bound to possess in the first case a more expanded brain organ, or in the latter case a more contracted brain organ, or even the other way about. But it is contradictory to nature for the brain to be such a plurality of internal organs, for nature gives the moments of the notion an existence of their own, and therefore puts the fluid simplicity of organic life clearly on one side, and its articulation and division with its distinctions clearly on the other, so that in the way they are to be grasped here, they display themselves as particular anatomical things. Similarly, with the question whether the development of the brain would enlarge or diminish the organ, whether it would make it coarser and thicker or finer. From the fact that it remains undetermined how the cause is constituted, it is equally left undetermined how the effect is produced in the skull, whether it is an enlarging or a narrowing and falling in of the latter. When this influence is defined, as it were, more imposingly as a stimulation, it is still undetermined whether this takes place by swelling, like the effect of a cantharitis plaster, or by shriveling, like the effect of vinegar. All views of this kind can be supported by plausible grounds. For the organic relation, which just as much plays a part, accommodates one view as readily as another, and is indifferent to all of this cleverness. Here in paragraph 330, Hegel is following up on what he was just talking about in paragraph 329, the relation, the causal relation between the brain on the one hand, as he's called it, the indwelling seat of spirit, where things are supposed to be happening because it's being for itself, right? It's got this reflexive relation to itself, as well as to the body. And the outer, the skull, the bone, as he's going to a little bit later say, spirit is turned into a bone by phrenology. And he says, okay, let's begin by thinking about what the causal relation is supposed to be here between the inner and the outer, between the brain and the skull. Let's say that the brain really does in some way affect the shape of the skull. It pushes it out or doesn't push it out, so it kind of squishes in or flattens it or whatever's going on, right? Having a big old brain gives you a big old forehead or something along those lines. So he says, as regards the determination in which the organ of self-consciousness, that's the brain, would act causally on the opposite aspect, that is the skull, all sorts of things can be said. Now that is a very pregnant thing to say. All sorts of things can be said. It's sort of like when somebody asks you a question like, well, what do you think about that person? You say, oh, there's a lot of different ways in which one might construe their actions. What are you saying? You're saying perhaps that you don't know, or there's multiple perspectives possible, and all of them are equally valid, or perhaps you don't actually want to say anything about the person. But here Hegel is saying, yeah, phrenology, you could do it a lot of different ways. It's sort of like, a coloring book, to take a completely, different analogy. You can fill in any way you like. As a matter of fact, you don't even have to stay within the lines. You can add in your own lines. You can draw things that aren't there in the coloring book. That's all fine for coloring, right? And the same thing is happening with the relation between the brain and the bodily aspect of it, the skull, the external thing that we can look at in phrenology. So he goes on and he says, what is in question is the constitution of a cause, which is considered in regard to its indifferent outer existence, shape, and size. A cause whose inner being and being for self are to be precisely of a kind which does not concern the immediate or outer existence. So if we're thinking in terms of what the brain is supposed to be doing, not just in terms of the brain as being a bunch of cells that are, all glommed together in a certain way, although that's quite fascinating as well, right? But if we think about what in Hegelian understanding of the relationship of consciousness to the body, the brain is supposed to be doing, the brain is supposed to be where spirit is carrying out its activities, so that doesn't look like something that is a bone. However cool bone may be and however well developed and interesting in its own right when we put it under the microscope, it's quite fascinating actually, it doesn't come anywhere close to what it is that makes a human being, a rational animal, engaged in meaningful action, living in culture, all these other sorts of things that we can say. So he goes on and he says, the organic spontaneous formation of the skull is indifferent to any mechanical influence exerted on it. Now, that's not quite true. I mean, we know we can bind people's skulls and their heads turn out looking kind of strange from our perspective. The cultures that did that apparently saw that as a sign of beauty or power. So it is possible to make the skull look different ways. Cradle boarding is another prime example of that. But that doesn't seem to affect the brain over much, in part because the brain is a really peculiar sort of organ, as we'll get to in a moment here. So he says, the organic spontaneous formation of the skull, the way the skull develops, is indifferent to any mechanical influence, and the relationship of these two relations, since the former is talking about the way the skull develops here, is a relating of itself to itself, is just this very indefiniteness and unboundedness. And then he says, let's put that aside. Here's something even more interesting to think about. Now here Hegel's going to say something that when you've learned some anatomy and physiology, you're probably going to disagree with. And so we have to put this into a proper context. So he says, even if the brain received into itself the distinctions of spirit as existential distinctions. Now, that's a little bit of a mistranslation there. He's talking about the being of the brain. And were a plurality of internal organs, each occupying a different space. Okay, let's stop right there for a second, because that is indeed how we often represent to ourselves the development of the brain. We say that, just for an example, looking at the evolution of the human brain, we talk about a earlier inheritance from, previous types of existence, a reptilian brain, which is concerned with, the fight and flight response and things along those lines. If I remember right, I think smell is oriented towards that part of the brain as well. And then we have the mammalian brain, which makes us capable of, among other things, higher emotions like caring for each other and feeling affection. And then we have the distinctively human part of the brain, which, for example, gives us the capacity to do pretty complex and things that we take for granted linguistic operations, right? And so we can say that there are parts of the brain that do certain things. That said, as it turns out, we find out sometimes people lose those parts of the brain and other parts of the brain eventually take over for them. So there is, what people have come to call nowadays, it's kind of a catchphrase, neuroplasticity, right? And I'm not talking about this in the sense, where the self-help stuff is. I'm talking about the fact that the brain is, in many respects, this organ that can reconfigure itself, it seems, in relation to its body so that it can get certain things done. So Hegel probably is off base here, right? In saying, well, if the brain, if we assumed that the brain had distinctions of spirit as existential distinctions, there are plurality of internal organs, each occupying a different space. He said, look, if you assume that sort of thing, the way those phrenologists do, and the phrenologists, at least in that respect, were right, then here's what would happen. He says it would be left undetermined whether a spiritual feature would, according as it was originally stronger or weaker, be bound to possess in the first case a more expanded brain organ, or in the latter case a more contracted brain organ, or even the other way about. He's pretty much right when it comes to that. Now we can talk about other things like the amount of electrical activity observed in certain parts of the brain. We can talk about how finely the neurons are connected to each other, that in certain parts of certain people's brains there's more neural connections, that is, connections between the cells that are, if we want to think about sub-organs, they are the tiniest little sub-organs. They're the basic unit of the wetware that is our brain. We can talk about that, but there is no necessary causal connection between a part of the brain being in a gross way big enough that it would push out on part of the skull and, like a rivet, pushing that bump out. And that's the way that the phrenologists were thinking about the way that the brain developed. So the idea would be, well, you've got more linguistic function than somebody else. So we take the guys who put together dictionaries, and then we'll look at their heads, and I'll bet you there's going to be one part of their brain that's pushing out on the skull, and they'll all have that in common. It doesn't turn out to be the case. We sometimes find people who, their head is kind of pushed in here on this side. I remember a guy like that when I was in the Army. And they're not any less intelligent than the rest of us because, the brain is pretty malleable. Different parts can show up in different ways. So Hegel's saying there's no inherent connection, even on the hypothesis, which turns out to be a true hypothesis, that there are sub-organs within the brain. There's no inherent connection between the way that sub-organ looks and whether it's more or less developed in terms of its size, in terms of something that would be gross in that way. There could be a much finer, like I said, tissue of connection within there. Might be a lot more activity happening in that part of the brain. But that doesn't push out an entire part of the head. So he says, here's where you got to interpret what he's saying with a little bit of a grain of salt. It's contradictory to nature for the brain to be such a plurality of internal organs, for nature gives the moments of the notion an existence of their own, and therefore puts the fluid simplicity of organic life clearly on one side, and its articulation and division with its distinctions clearly on the other, so that in the way they're grasped here, they display themselves as particular anatomical things. Is he saying that because the brain is the indwelling seat of spirit, as he's called it before, that the brain is just one sort of continuum full of neurons or connections, or maybe you conceived of it in terms of the lobes or things along those lines? He is right in a sense that the brain is not simply reducible insofar as it's a living person's brain, a person who actually has consciousness that's somehow working through the brain as its organ. It's not reducible to just a bunch of, plug-in parts that you can connect up with each other, sort of like Legos or like, an erector set or a circuit board or something like that. But he is wrong in thinking that the brain doesn't differentiate itself into sub-organs and that couldn't be part of the way in which Geist or spirit works. So if we put that aside, and sometimes, we do have to say Hegel seems to be wrong about this. Let's put that aside. What is the main point that he's after here? He says, even if we accepted that, right? He says, similarly with the question of whether the development of the brain would enlarge or diminish the organ, whether it would make it coarser or thicker or finer. What's he getting at? So let's say we do assume that there are these, divisions or distinctions within the brain, which does seem to be the case, right? Then what we have to say is, do these translate into areas of the skull? Can we look at the skull, the external thing, and figure out whether more development or less development of those parts, those divisions, those distinctions, those sub-organs, those organic things, whether that would actually be reflected in the skull? Hegel says, I guess it could be, But there's no reason why they would be associated in the way that you, the phrenologist, take them to be. I mean, if we're going to proceed on this hypothesis, we don't know whether development of a part pushes the skull in or pushes the skull out or draws the skull in or makes it flat or makes it round, or we don't really know any of these things. So you phrenologists are kind of making it up as you go along. Remember back a few passages before, sort of like the housewife who says, yes, it always rains when I do my laundry. She's generalizing from a very small amount of cases and probably obscuring the evidence as she does so. Or, so we don't have to pick on the housewife, the trader who also says something like that. Whenever I go to market, it always rains for me, right? Something similar is going on with the phrenologist who is making these cases. So he's got a funny example here. He says, when this influence is defined, as it were, more imposingly as a stimulation, right? We use different terminology to make it seem like we're talking about something real. He says it's undetermined. Whether this takes place by swelling, like when you put a cantharitis plaster on, something that would be an irritant and make you swell up, or by shriveling, like the effect of vinegar, right? Some very prosaic stuff here. He says, here's the key. All views of this kind can be supported by plausible grounds. Plausible grounds. We'll come back to that in a second. For the organic relation, which just as much plays a part, accommodates one view as readily as another, and is indifferent to all of this cleverness. So plausible is not quite the same thing as necessity or a causal relation, right? We can come up with all sorts of plausible explanations for things, but we want something more than mere plausibility. That, unfortunately, is what phrenology is not going to supply us with, or anything analogous to phrenology in the way that it understands the brain in relation to something external.